This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 385, Off the Cuff. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Drupal 10, Skillsrot, and Contrib with our hosts. For those of you that join us regularly, this might feel a little bit different for you. That's because we had a last-minute cancellation. So we are going to fill this show in with some of our favorite topics, and we're just going to have a good old-fashioned conversation. For those of you that don't know, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today joining me are my co-hosts, Catherine Druckman, Open Source Evangelist at Intel, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development.
Good morning, or afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. Happy to be here.
It's a podcast, Nick. People can listen 24/7.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
There you go. Way to cover it. And also joining us, Martin Anderson Klutz, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia. Before we jump into our plethora of primary topics today, Martin, let's talk about the module of the week.
Thanks, John. I thought this week we would talk about the Path Auto module. It was previously covered in a couple of modules very early on in the sort of history of this podcast, one being around SEO and another about setting up Drupal as a blogging platform. But it's actually never been covered as a module of the week, even though, in my opinion, it's probably one of the few modules that might actually be really good to include in core. For anyone not familiar with Path Auto, it automatically generates SEO-friendly URLs or path aliases for various kinds of content, so nodes, taxonomy terms, users, and so on, without requiring the user to manually provide that path alias. The module was originally created in February of 2005, so quite old, but it has versions available. The most recent version is 8.x-1.11, which was created in August of 2022. And is ready for Drupal 10. It has definitely been, periodically updated, as we can see by that recent release. In terms of the number of open issues, it has 600 open issues, but only 235 are for the 8.x branch, and of those, only 106 are bugs, which is pretty good when you consider that the module is in use by over 570,000 Drupal websites. Yeah. In terms of the maintainers, the recent releases are by Berdir, who is a very prolific maintainer in his own right. And in terms of how it works, it really allows you to define patterns that will be used to generate those readable path aliases, often using, the title or other metadata. It really relies on tokens as the way to sort of provide those bits of data that will be converted into the path alias into sort of your structured URL. And then that can include things like, the menu path, the names of associated taxonomy terms, the date your content was published, and more. It's also a useful module for helping with breadcrumbs by automatically sort of creating path segments that can then sort of be translated into, links elsewhere within your Drupal site. So let's talk about the Path Auto module, because I'm sure everybody on this call has used it before.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those all-star. It's one of those all-star modules. I can't believe that we've never had it as module of the week. It's kind of mind-blowing. I also want to point out one of the other really cool features that it has is some bulk operations. So you can, if you decide to change your rules on a rebuild or, for some marketing reason, there's a way to bulk update certain content types or entity types. You can also bulk delete. You can bulk generate. If you're inheriting a site where they just didn't use these and everything was like node 1, node 2, node 3, node 4, whatever, you can use it to bulk generate as well. So it's got a lot of handy little tools in it. It is definitely one of those sites, one of those modules that almost always gets installed on every site. Even if you have clients where they pay very close attention to URLs and generally override them, it's good to have kind of a fallback just in case.
Yeah, it begs the question, like, when does Path Auto make it into core? Because it feels like it's kind of like a chicken and the egg thing, right? Because Path Auto requires token and token's not in core. So like then token has to be in core, and like, so maybe it'll never get into core, but it feels like one of those things that like everybody's installing on their site.
Yeah.
Because, you know, human readable paths are kind of important these days, even though I have different debates with folks on whether people actually read URLs or not. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those things where, you know, I think I use this on every site that I build.
Yeah, I would be confused if a site didn't use it. I would wonder why. There are a few that if you're not using a distribution, I suppose, but if you must install, Path Auto would be probably the top of the list. Up there might be admin toolbar, not to go on a tangent, but yeah, it's definitely like, why would you not use that on a site item?
So I guess one use case where I think people might not use it, and it's not even a really good use case, so I'm ashamed that I'm bringing it up, but is like if you were using Drupal as just a content tool, right, for like a headless front end.
Yeah, it's headless.
Right.
Your headless front end may not be, your headless front end may be defining its own paths, and you might not need, you know, Path Auto. You know, headless projects that I've worked on, the path is actually coming from Drupal. So like Path Auto is installed because you need that functionality, but that might not be the case for everybody, I guess.
Yeah, the other thing I can see too is in some cases people may want kind of, you know, to use that node / as almost like a permalink type capability, and having better visibility on that may be useful. Yeah. But I agree. Basically, every Drupal site I've ever worked on has used Path Auto.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, Martin, as always, thank you.
I just have one more. I just have one more thing to add. This is one of those modules. This is one of those modules too that when I'm building a new, if it's been a while since I've initiated a project, I sometimes have a moment of confusion when I go to add them and it just doesn't exist. So it's like, wait, that's coming. That's not in core. It's coming from a contributor module. And then of course I just install it. But it, you know, there is that moment of confusion sometimes. But yeah.
I'm usually confused at the point where I go to a page and I'm like, why didn't the URL to this page update? And then I go, right, got to install the module, turn it on, configure it, you know, do things. Cool. Well, Martin, as always, thank you for another wonderful module of the week. And let's move on to our kind of open-ended primary topic here. Nick Laughlin, you want to talk a little bit about some recent contributions?
Yeah, so there's kind of two subtopics here. The first one is I want to thank Martin and Matthew for helping with the calendar view module, and specifically with Smart Date. Both of them I raised an issue where the recurring dates wasn't working with calendar view, and I did a little bit of exploration, but Martin was quick to jump in and test a bunch of stuff too. And Matthew just released 2.0.1 yesterday, which fixes a lot of issues with how recurring dates work in the calendar view. So one of the things I'm curious about, I guess the first question, this wasn't really intentional, but the first question is for you, Martin, is what's your philosophy behind those types of collaborations? Like when you see another module trying to integrate with one of the modules you kind of maintain?
I mean, I would say in general, I'm just all about trying to have those kinds of collaborations. Number one, because I think anytime you get the opportunity to sort of, you know, work hand in hand with somebody who is, you know, doing some great work on their own, that there's definitely an opportunity to sort of learn from some of the things that they're doing, as well as to, you know, potentially have the work that you've already done on your own module, you know, work in additional use cases by sort of integrating with that other module. I think in this particular case, it had actually worked out really well because a couple of years ago, I had gone through a process with the full calendar view module in terms of sort of, you know, similarly troubleshooting, you know, why didn't Smart Date work with that module? And so I think that sort of helped giving me some ideas in terms of some things to sort of test out in the view configuration.
Yeah, I think this is really nitty gritty, but one of the things we discovered yesterday, because I actually jumped on a call with Matthew yesterday morning to look at it, is Smart Date doesn't use the date time interface, I think, for instantiating the date object. And I suspect it has to do with the fact that you're using the recur library or something. But I think that's why some modules see Smart Date by default, and others don't. But yeah, again, this is a huge shout out too for Smart Date. I was really impressed again yesterday when I realized if you add a recurring date rule. So, for example, you say I want this to be every Monday, every week, every Monday, 11 to 10 p.m. It's very easy to then go in and override a certain day. And not only override it, there's like a revert button, which will so if you override like 3 weeks from now and set it for a different time and then realize later that you don't need to override that, like it's very easy to just set it back to the original time. So very, very impressed with Smart Date again.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at doing that recurring date functionality, I really tried to think about, what's an approach that could maybe set it a bit apart from some of the existing solutions for recurring dates. And it felt like storing those as field values would make a lot of things easier, like this kind of views integration, because it basically, it means that all of those values are kind of available to views without having to do any kind of additional kind of transformation or, pull in related entities or anything like that.
Very cool. The other thing I want to talk about related to contribution is related to core. So one of the things I decided this year is I wanted to kind of push past my comfort level, I guess, with contribution. And one of the areas that I've been a little bit reticent to contribute back, maybe with some imposter syndrome, is core. I'll respond to issues and debug stuff and test stuff, but I've never really written patches, or maybe I've re-rolled patches, but never really written patches from scratch. And I was inspired with our show a few weeks ago with Benjamin talking about the accessibility to kind of take care of that pager issue. And one of the things that I'm realizing is a big barrier to entry for debugging on core is I don't even want to say it's a lack of documentation, because I think some of this stuff is documented. But I think one of the issues that Drupal has with some of these things is discoverability of documentation.
Yeah.
And in particular, so yeah, Catherine, you might have some ideas on.
I have a lot of thoughts about this, actually. Yeah. Yeah, no, the documentation, it's tough. So the number one thing you said is imposter syndrome. So that was what I felt tremendously, about my first core contributions, which, I thought that no, that's for real Drupal developers. I don't know what that means. I just, it wasn't me, whatever it was. It certainly wasn't me. I can't contribute to core until I was in a position where it was like part of my job, and I don't know that I would have ever gotten over that hurdle without like a literal support. With Ben, you just mentioned Ben Mullins. He was one of the people that helped me do a lot of contributions in Claro. And yeah, without actual human beings, like in a kind of a core contributor mentor position, I don't know that I would have gotten over it on my own. I think you really kind of need that one-on-one, and how to translate that experience of being slightly handheld through your first few contributions. I don't know how to translate that into documentation. That's tough. And
I don't think it does. I don't think you can translate. Like, you can't give people confidence through words. Well, okay, so that's not 100% true. Obviously, plenty of written material out there that have given people either real or manufactured confidence. But I think like a lot of projects suffer from documentation issues, right? Because like the bigger your project is, the more documentation there is, right? And it's always hard to sometimes hard to keep it organized, sometimes hard to point people in the right direction. But I think like the imposter syndrome thing, like it's not, I don't know that it's a documentation issue. I think it's like it falls into the realm of mentoring. Like I think that's where that kind of gets like that gets uncovered and resolved, right? Is that, and you both just highlighted that with Ben saying like, oh, hey, here's, an issue, like here, let me help you guys try to overcome that. Right. so I think it comes down to like mentoring a little bit more from what I'm hearing, but like I also think there's probably a documentation issue because like there's a bunch of documentation and it's not always up to date or organized the best way possible.
And let me kind of walk through the couple of issues that I ran into because that might be helpful to set the stage. Because I think there were 3 key things that happened that I ended up resolving, but I didn't even know like where to look, where to ask, like if there was a Slack channel to ask the questions. So for example, with Ben's help, I created that issue for the H4 stuff, and we'll have this issue in the show notes if you want to follow along. I posted that. He gave the accessibility device that I needed. I provided the patch for that fix. It got tested, and I was using the merge flow, the merge request workflow, right? So there was a merge request, and it passed all the tests. It was accepted. It was merged. And one of the things that Core does is when something is fixed for 10.1, it's backported to 10.0 and 9.5. Well, they merged that, and then it started breaking tests in 9.5, right? And so, which is fine. I mean, that's why we have tests. Like something was different in Drupal 9 than Drupal 10 that caused tests to fail. So XJM reverted that just for 9.5 and put a patch for that revert. And so, and just mention what the issue was and what the tests that needed to be fixed. Well, at that point, that was my first issue. I wasn't sure the proper way to proceed at that point because I had a merge request already merged. There was a patch that she had generated for 9.5. Like, should I just start from that patch? Should I create a new issue so I can use another merge request? Should I create a new issue fork? How do I change the issue fork to point at 9.5? Right? And those are, in an everyday job, working in an agency, it's just like, okay, where do you want me to rebase this? Where do you want me to start? Right? But Drupal has kind of its own unique flavor on top of the workflow. So I ended up, so I asked the question, but then I got impatient and decided to try fixing it. And I just started with that patch, right? Which seemed to be the right thing. Issue number 2 was apparently, and I found this out from an issue a similar issue related to the same problem that Mike Gifford and Zuri Zerman both had worked on. Apparently in Drupal 9 with Classy, they have file hashes of all the templates to compare against. There's a test that compares against the file hash to make sure that the files don't accidentally change. So obviously if you purposely change them, you need to regenerate those hashes. Well, that was the next thing. Like, how did you generate those hashes? So I ended up looking through the test code and found out where they're comparing it, how they're generating it. And if you look at the issue, you'll notice there was quite a bit of back and forth on my side creating patches until I finally figured out how to read the test correctly and get them generated properly. But again, it was one of those things where I didn't even know that Core hash files to compare against. I didn't know how to generate that hash. I didn't know where to store that, right? And again, I spent some time Googling it and couldn't quite find anything. Wasn't sure where to ask, but eventually I figured it out and got it fixed, and now it's RTBC again. Thanks, Sean. But
sure,
again,
no
those 2 issues are types of things that like you said, sometimes maybe it's better for mentorship.
Yeah, I think they probably are. One question I have, I guess, is on the patch that you developed, and admittedly I didn't test it for 9.5. I tested it against 10. But does your patch now work for 9.5? Does it pass the tests for 9.5?
Well, that patch is explicitly I don't know how you would have tested it on 10 because Classy was removed from 10. So it explicitly works for 9.5 because it's for Classy, right?
And that's Classy, right?
Yeah, and that's why it didn't fail. Why the merge request didn't fail on Drupal 10 because Classy doesn't exist anymore. So none of those tests exist anymore.
Got it. Okay, so that makes sense. All right. So I was under the impression it was a Drupal 10 patch, but obviously not because got it. Interesting.
And then there's one final thing that I ran into, and again, these are questions. Should they be documentation? Should there be a different place in Slack where people can ask these types of questions? But Benjamin recommended that we split the issue into 2 issues, one for general core themes and one for stable 9, right? Because stable 9 generally has a rule that you can't change it, right? For a major version. It's stable, that's the point. But there's an argument to be made that this should be merged back because it's an accessibility fix, right? An accessibility fix is different than a refactor or a new feature, right? So again, I created the patch, the merge request for that. It got RTBC'd, and then they mentioned that they wanted a release note for it, which again makes sense. If you're changing something that generally is meant not to be changed, there should be a release note. There's a lot of documentation on creating release notes for core, but again, it's not something I've done before. So it's like the question again becomes, who do you turn to ask those questions? Do you just post it in the issue queue and wait? Do you post it in Slack somewhere? Do you just generate it and see if you did it right? That's one of those questions have been on my mind a lot lately. I don't know the answer. I think, I honestly don't know.
Sounds to me like you need a core mentor.
maybe that's
We
the
all
answer.
do.
Yeah,
I don't know,
if I can maybe just chime in a couple of quick thoughts to close the loop on the documentation question. Something that's been a little bit of a point of frustration for me for a while now is the fact that if you like Google something, the Google results invariably take you to like an 8.6 version or like really ancient version. And I think that there's an issue open against the project that generates that documentation around basically setting a canonical tag so they can always point to the most recent version. So, fingers crossed at some point that gets in, and then, that way Google can always be pointing to like, the current stable version as opposed to something from like, 5 or 8 years ago. The other thing too that I've noticed about the documentation is that oftentimes the Drupal.org documentation is really around like how something works as opposed to like how to accomplish something, like how you would use it, sort of a thing. And that's actually where, there's been a lot of great work by the community to sort of, write different tutorials or cheat sheets or some of those other kinds of things. So it's great that material is there, but, from my standpoint, I feel like sometimes if there could be more of that sort of like, here's how to accomplish something with it, as opposed to just like, here's how that system works internally, that would probably be pretty helpful for a lot of devs too.
Well, it's like you need like what is it called? A persona, like documentation per persona, right? So like, am I a person using Drupal as a content management system? Am I a developer contributing to Drupal? Am I new to Drupal? Like, what's the persona that you're trying to like get support for, right? Before you jump into the documentation.
Well, part of it too is those examples used to be part of the comments. Like if you went to api.drupal.org and you were looking up entity query, people would have, especially in the beginning of Drupal, people would have comments there. They'll be like, here's how you find a node that has this field that doesn't exist. And it'll show like, query not exists, whatever. But those comments are tied to the specific version of Drupal that they got added to. So they just disappear. Even if they're, so maybe a way to be like, this was like something to move those comments forward and just like flag, like this was generated for 8.4. It may not be accurate anymore, and then a way to flag like, hey, I tested this on 9.5 and it works there too. So
confused. You guys don't like getting instructions and documentation for Drupal 6?
Well, you might need it. You never know.
Thankfully, 6 and 7 have dropped away. But what I mean is a lot of the stuff a lot of those comments are really valuable. But they like if like Martin said, when you Google it, you end up on 8.6. So the first thing you do is you switch to 9 or 10 because you want to look at that. But those comments don't exist for 9 and 10. People didn't copy and paste their comments, which is reasonable. Like why would they? But we're also losing a lot of information that way because it's not there anymore.
Sounds like a core initiative needs to be started for like documentation upkeep and maintenance.
Well,
documentation, organization, upkeep, and maintenance.
I feel like I have to defend Drupal's documentation just a tiny bit because Drupal actually has phenomenal documentation. I mean, compared to any other open source project out there, it is fantastic. And there is actually quite a bit. I remember because I contributed to a little bit of it. There is a pretty clear divide, even with the personas that you mentioned. There is a lot of documentation dedicated just to end users, a lot of documentation dedicated just to contributors, a lot of documentation just to, for developers. But even still, I think that's the thing. Even as excellent as it is, and as well thought out and targeted and all of that, it's still so tough to translate certain concepts.
And
It's a great reference material. Like once somebody has slightly held your hand over that hump of understanding, then it's great to refer. Oh, I can't remember. Wait, how do I, roll a patch? I don't know, whatever it is. Then it's fantastic. But there is this initial barrier of understanding that's so tough and impossible to translate into that format, I think.
Well, it's also the discoverability. It's the same thing like with the names of the modules, right? A lot of Path Auto is a great name for a great module, right? It tells you pretty much exactly what it does. Token is a great name for a great module. Views, not so great name for a great module.
Is Token really a great name for a great module? I mean, it is a great module, but like, how do I know it's not an access? How do I know it's not an access?
Okay, maybe not. Maybe it's a middling name for a great module, right? Paragraphs, terrible name for a great module, right? So, and it's the same thing. Like you have some documentation, like for example, if you're looking to upgrade from Composer 1 to Composer 2, and you Google how to do that in Drupal, you'll get you'll get the right page, and it's very clearly documented. The release notes, when I Googled how to do release notes for core, it was pretty easy to find that, right? And pretty clear. There was a lot more documentation than I thought I needed. When I was trying to figure out how to do the content hash for that test, maybe there's documentation for that, but it was one of those things where I didn't even know what to Google. Like I was Googling, like, I mean, it was literally faster for me to just look into the test and see how they were generating it to compare it than it was to find documentation.
Yeah. So, I mean, it ultimately sounds like an organization and findability problem, right? Because I agree with you, Catherine. Like Drupal does have great documentation, and a lot of people put a lot of hard work into making sure the documentation is up to date. So like, don't think that I'm saying like, hey, like the documentation is poor. Like I think we have really, really good documentation. But I think like it definitely has a little bit of a findability issue. It's like we almost need like a Google search engine for Drupal documentation.
Yeah.
Which
too much of a good thing, hard to wade through.
or like because I mean even myself, like when looking at documentation for certain things, like I find myself like you sometimes see this like weird like shift where you're like reading Drupal 9 documentation, and then all of a sudden you're reading something and you're like, wait a second, then you realize like, oh, it's Drupal 8 documentation. Like what? Like how did I get here? I don't even know how I jumped from one to the other. But yeah, that's not, I think, a problem we're going to solve right now. I mean, maybe if we spent the next year talking about it and working
it's also mostly written by people who probably don't remember what it's like to not be an expert.
Yeah.
That's the I mean that's true of anything. That's true of any kind of learning process.
And the truth is it's one of those things too where the core contributors, maintainers are very talented and a limited resource. They're also probably the most qualified to write that documentation, but they already have a mountain of work, right? That they're responsible for. So it's hard. It's one of those things like it's something we've been talking about on the show for a long time is sustainability. Like how do you get more core contributors so that it's spread out? You have better documentation, but if they just spend their whole time documenting, then Drupal itself starts to suffer the code base, right?
Also a little bit like a knowledge gap problem too, right? Because like as I think Catherine just said, like if you're new to Drupal, right, you may not have the knowledge or the skill set to understand whatever level of documentation you're looking at, right? So like it's almost helpful to like be able to like tag the documentation like, oh, this documentation's for beginners. Like, okay, cool. Like, so it's going to have real basic terms and there's going to be a little bit of hand holding in it as opposed to like maybe like some sort of API documentation that's like, oh, this is for more advanced users that like understand the API in general before jumping into it, right? All great ideas. Go ahead, Martin.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing we should acknowledge is that, in addition to sort of just documentation about how to use Drupal, even if you look at Drupal's API page, there are so many great APIs, and that's one of the things that makes Drupal really powerful as something that can be sort of, extended and molded into whatever kind of a web application you need to build. But by the same token, all of that needs documentation. And so, not just the level of expertise, but even the sheer volume of things that need to be documented is also, I think, pretty daunting. So it is quite a testament that we have as good documentation as we already do.
Also makes me wonder, just in what you were saying, is like, I'm wondering if there's like a quote unquote get off the island opportunity here to team up with another project, service, utility, something to kind of like organize and provide the documentation in a more digestible way. But yeah, I don't know what the answer is there.
But I recall.
Oh, go ahead.
So, I was just going to say quickly, I recall reading an anecdote that I think it was Angie Byron wrote about having contributed a documentation fix to GitLab. And then within a week, a package showed up at her door that was like, I can't remember if it was like a coffee mug, but just some kind of an actual physical token for having contributed to documentation, and sort of, raising the question, is there an opportunity for Drupal to maybe do more as an incentive for people to, get them contributing to documentation as well?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
As we're having this conversation, I'm remembering previous conversations we've had with John O'Bacon about, kind of that community management aspect, right? Because there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of community management that needs to potentially happen here. And that example you just provided, I think, is a great one, Martin, where like, a community member basically just got something in the mail totally out of the blue for making a contribution, which is a nice surprise. And I'm sure Angie, appreciated it.
And final comment before we finally move on to our next off the cuff. These are meant to be 5 to 10 minute discussions, but we're all passionate about contributing. I have to say, even with those, hurdles that I ran into, it's still, I've never been so invested in an issue. I mean, I've fixed issues, like I've tracked issues before, but I've never been so invested in an issue in my life as these ones. Just,
that's awesome.
Solving these issues. It's definitely satisfying to see, see these things get closed that people have been dealing with for a long time. So it's definitely worth it. And people have certainly been helping out. So definitely appreciate everybody that's chimed in and helped me get in the right direction.
Cool. All right. So in our pre-show, Catherine brought up a great topic. She was wondering about, how do you kind of keep up with your knowledge base when it's not necessarily part of your day-to-day job. And I chimed in with the term skill decay, or as you can see in the show title, skill rot, which is I think a little bit more fun, right? So Catherine, why don't you give us a little bit more of an overview of kind of what you were thinking?
Yeah, sure. What I was thinking, well, so it's a lot of things. I mean, part of it is, I'd have to tell a little bit more of my story, but, in different times in my career, I've had to do more or less development, right? Some of it was, and then, engineering and, just completely different skill sets that I use at any different phase, right? And now that I've moved on to what I'm doing now, which is open source evangelism, it's a very different thing. I haven't touched Drupal. Well, gosh, even before I joined Intel, when I was still at Acquia, I wasn't really working on Drupal for the last, I don't know. I don't think I've worked with Drupal for over a year, which is kind of a weird thing for me to say, because I worked with Drupal every day for, probably 15 years. And then now I'm like, I don't really touch it. I don't have a reason to right now. And I'm very busy with other things. And I would like to go back and, kind of pay forward some of the things that I learned about core contributing, for example, in Drupal. And someday I plan to do that. But there's a big question. And because technical skills have a very short half-life, right? Everything's evolving very quickly, and you really need to stay fresh. And something that I knew how to do 10 years ago is probably not relevant today. Maybe a little bit of it, and the
Drupal
process
7.
of learning it is relevant, and I can apply
Huh.
that. And it's really, but technical skills are really about learning how to learn
Yeah.
quickly and frequently and constantly, and all
So
those things. So it's that, yeah. Anyway.
I don't think you ever lose that ability, right, to
No.
learn, right? So again, in the pre-show, and this is something that I will say is near and dear to my heart, right? Because previously to being a solution architect, this go around, I made the choice to switch to account management in my last role, and part of my, I had a very similar kind of thought process to what you were talking about. Was like, well, if I switch to this account management role, like, am I going to suffer from skill decay, right? Are my development skills, are my, Drupal site building skills going to just disappear? And while I was making that decision, or shortly after I'd already made the switch, I went to a talk at, I want to say it was Nerd Summit, maybe, where somebody was talking about, about like, hey, going into like elevating from developer to manager, or from like a development role to a more business focused role, right? And they were like, your skills are going to just disappear. Like it was like real doom and gloom. And I was like, as a person, you're like, well, I don't want that, right? Like, I don't want that to happen to me. Like, it reduces my ability, my options, right? So, like, I understand like what you're saying, and like, I think for me at least, and I'd love to hear from others here, but like for me, what ended up happening was like I got into this account management role, and then like in my kind of like free time, my open source contributions kind of increased a little bit, because I was like, okay, like I gotta move my personal website to like a new version of Drupal, and I gotta like really get involved with like building up my personal blog, so that way I can keep those skills relatively fresh, right? Just because that was important to me. And come to find out a year later, I switched from the account management back into a solutions architecture role where, I'm not doing Git commits every day like I was in the past, but like I still need the ability to kind of read a Git log. I need the ability to like build Drupal sites and do POCs. So like keeping up with those skills in that way was super important. I'm actually excited because that story and many more may be presented at DrupalCon. Martin reached out to me and was like, hey, do you want to talk about like the path from like developer to like, business person, like business, interacting with business and that sort of thing. And super excited to hopefully talk about that. We'll see if it gets accepted, but.
Well, I think it goes another level too. Like these skills can atrophy even if you're not transitioning out of a development role, right? I've worked with developers at agencies where, their skills have atrophied because they only work on one project. So they're still active developers, but the site that they're working on was built 8 years ago. So they're still using older theme build processes. They're still using like they're maintaining one project, so they're not seeing new way. There's no reason to introduce new processes, right? It's one of the things I see, for example, Storybook. I started using Storybook. I use Storybook in every project now going forward, and the only reason why I started using it was because a new project had a requirement for a non-twig based component library, so I started looking at the options, right? But if I was just building Drupal themes using Twig, I probably would have still been stuck with Pattern Lab, right? So it can happen even to developers. But with solution architects, I think what I see is it's not that the thought processes go away. It's just that you or that you lose skills. It's more that you're not introduced to the new ways of doing things, right? You're not introduced to, if you're, for example, storage, right? I like to use storage for a lot of projects now. But if you're a solutions architect that's not building sites day to day, you're probably just going to say paragraphs out of the box, right?
Well, I would say layout builder, but we can have that battle at some other point in time. Yeah, so I think like part of that Nick, you're right on there. And I think part of that is like going out to conferences and listening to Drupal focused podcasts.
I was about to say, this is a great way.
And even not Drupal focused podcasts, right? So like I listen to general tech podcasts as well and other things, because I think like you definitely want to have a broader vision or a broader insight into the wider tech world, right? But I'm kind of interested to hear, Catherine, from your point of view, where your job like is open source focused, right? But it might not be specifically like building things focused, right? How do you feel like you kind of keep up with those skills, or do you feel like, yeah, my need for those skills has kind of shifted, so now I'm kind of like moving towards building other skills?
Oh God, that's a hard question to answer. So I mean, I try, or at least I think I'm trying to keep up some of those, because on one hand, yes, I don't have a great need for certain skills that I used to use every day, but there are enough of them translate over into the stuff that I'm focused on that you kind of do stay fresh just by necessity, because you have to kind of take where you've been to inform where you're going. Like, let's say I'm very interested in software supply chain security right now. I talk about this with a lot of people all the time. Well, the fact that I spent a lot of time working on CI/CD pipelines and stuff like that informs the opinions that I have today. So I still, even though I'm not necessarily hands-on with those things as much, I manage to keep the ideas fresh enough, just because there's enough of overlap, I guess. So, but it's a struggle.
You have like of it, but you're not like an expert in it, right? So you have like enough of a knowledge
that's the thing. Yes.
to be able to like pull in, and imagine like similarly to EPAM, like Intel probably has a lot of subject matter experts in a lot of different things. So like
so many.
if you were like, oh, I need a subject matter expert in this thing, I know of it, let me go reach out and see who I can pull in.
That's a fantastic thing, actually. Yeah.
So it kind of helps you not have to be like so connected to some of these things.
Yes.
I feel like I want to ask Martin too, but I feel like his answer is going to be I stay up to speed by just writing 3 modules a week.
That's a pretty good one.
So the other thing I was going to kind of add to what John already said around sort of contribution and sort of those side projects as a great way to stay current is really trying to sort of follow your curiosity. So I've gone through phases where I was really interested in like location and mapping, and then for a while I was really into search results and how you can sort of like do weird and wonderful things with your Solr search results, and obviously the last couple of years dates and time zones and all of that stuff has been a focus, and even now there will be things come up like I have ideas around how we could make Drupal self-documenting and all these different ideas. And so when you have the time to just sort of noodle away at these things, I think it's a great way to sort of, well, the way that I used to do that thing 2 years ago on this other module, now I get fatal errors if I try that. And so you start to learn, in Drupal 10.0, we've introduced this new method. And so, those are the kinds of things where, just sort of naturally help you to stay more current.
Yeah, so 2 points there. One is I've just suddenly realized that all of Martin's interests relate to time travel, location, date and time, and searching for different things. Very interesting. May or may not be building a time machine. The second one there, I think, is like, a certain like skill rot, right? Sounds terrible. Skill decay sounds terrible, right? But like a certain amount of that, I think, is healthy, right? Because like out of the 4 of us, who still remembers how to build like a Shockwave application or like some sort of action scripts,
Compass and Ruby,
thing, or Compass and Ruby, right? So like there are certain skills that can just like can just disintegrate.
Skills rebirth.
Yeah, exactly, right. So like I think you have to look at that at least from my point of view, like you have to look at it as like, where do I want to go? And then what skills do I need to be successful in where I'm going? So like, that's definitely, it's definitely an interesting topic.
I have a quote that I heard recently that I've been sticking on, sticky notes here and there. But that is, you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And I have to remind myself of that. And I think that applies to this conversation a little bit, in that I can become familiar with a lot of different things at a very shallow level, and then a few, different things at a deep level. And I have to remind myself of that constantly. And so I really need to kind of pick my area.
The common thread that I'm hearing from the three of you is, I mean, the way that you keep it is you find something that you do where you're still actually actively building something. So you might not be building sites day to day, but John, you found your personal project. Martin, you find some usually contributed project that you're going to work on. But I know you do a lot of proof of concepts too in your day job, right? And then Catherine, you're still trying to find out.
Too.
Yeah.
I don't know. No, I know. I have to dabble too, because I have to do demos and proof of concept, same stuff.
POCs are like at least when I was in the account management thing, like I would still do a POC. Like if I was talking to somebody and it was getting to the point where like they were like almost ready to like pull the trigger, I would like, I might whip up a POC to be like, oh, well, we could do something like this, or like, hey, you could do something like that. And like, I think like, I won't say POCs saved me, but I think there's even today, like I do a lot of POCs, but that's more job related. But I think like if you can try to integrate it a little bit into your day to day, like that's good. But yeah, I mean, I think finding that side project that keeps you into what you want to be in. And then like one thing that I did, it was like reevaluate. Like I did this account management thing for a year, and then I was kind of like, I don't know if this is necessarily for me. All right, let's talk about Drupal 10. It's here. It's a thing. Some people have used it. Some people haven't. Martin, how are you using Drupal 10, or are you using Drupal 10?
So I actually tried to update, or at least I ran upgrade status on my personal site. And I think like a lot of folks have found going through the same process, there's one or two modules that aren't ready. And so, I have to kind of go through that evaluation of, is the functionality that module provides valuable enough that I want to hold off upgrading to Drupal 10, or should I just axe it and then move on and maybe down the road, if I really want it, find some kind of an alternate solution. I was playing around with it recently because there is one module that I've been holding off upgrading because it's a CK editor plugin, and one that was sort of forked from a CK editor for community plugin. And so it actually required some rewriting of JavaScript that was...
Which plugins were those? I would say
a little bit on the ambitious side, but fortunately somebody from the community actually posted a patch to sort of get the ball rolling. And then between the two of us, we were able to sort of, get that to a point where we could at least tag an alpha release of a new version supporting CKEditor 5 and Drupal 10. So that was a fun process, and it got me actually using Drupal 10. It does feel like there's a few things that, don't work quite the same way. So as a very simple example, there was something in 10.0 where the height, or sort of like the number of rows that you set as the attribute for the WYSIWYG isn't respected. And so that's a fix that's coming in 10.1. But, when you first use 9 or 10.0, or probably even CKEditor 5 in 9.5, it feels a little bit different. So there's, some...
You're like, why is my body field so small?
Exactly.
Right.
So some of those small things, I mean, that being said, there's already been a lot of really interesting things contributed to that 10.1 branch. So, here we are, just at the end of January, but there's already a bunch of things that we can look forward to coming down the pipe in June when we get that 10.1 release.
I have to say, even though, and I think we might have briefly mentioned this last week, but even though like there's still that one or two modules that I think every site is waiting on, it's still so much faster. I mean, it's infinitely faster than 7 to 8. It's so much faster, even 8 to 9. But I think that's why it's making me so impatient. Like it's so much faster, but it's still like, okay, it's not quite there.
So yes, I agree. I agree with you, Nick, except in the instance where a module's maintainer is no longer either maintaining it or has stepped away, or
no, that happened with 8 to 9 as well. I mean, I didn't seriously consider upgrading I seriously didn't consider upgrading any sites from 8 to 9 until 9.1 came out. Honestly.
So the stat that I heard Gabor use is that at launch for Drupal 10, there were 26% more contrib modules that were Drupal 10 ready than the equivalent when Drupal 9 was launched. So there definitely has been a lot of community work in terms of getting those contributed.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. There has been a ton of community work, and like the transition from 8 to 9, 9 to 10 has been is miles ahead of where we were, hundreds of miles ahead of where we were from like 7 to 8, right? I guess my frustration, right, similarly to what Martin did, I did the same thing. Martin, cover your ears, but I used Pantheon, so I spun up another multi-dev instance, and I installed the status update module, or upgrade status module rather. And like the 3 modules so some of the issues were like, oh, like apply this patch, or like, oh, do this thing, like whatever, easy, right? The 3 modules that were not compatible needed updates, like Cloudflare. And I was like, wait, what? I'm like, how is that even like possible? Like literally could not figure it out for the life of me. Went into the issue queue, was like, what's going on here? And it was like, oh, well, the Cloudflare module was looking for a maintainer, and they had to go through the abandoned project, protocol and get a new maintainer. So like that all took a bunch of time, right? And a bunch of effort. Now there's a new maintainer. Things are starting to move ahead, which is great. But the other 2 modules that I need are, relatively small modules. One is the like read create blocks module, which is like, I don't even know if people are actually still using that, but the maintainer's like nowhere to be found. There's an issue in the issue queue, like with a patch ready to go, like could easily just be applied, re-roll a version and call it a day.
You should apply to become a maintainer.
I don't want to do that, Nick. I don't want to maintain. Like it feels to me, and that's I brought this up, and like I don't know. There was a Slack conversation about it, right? Where it was like, oh, just become a maintainer to get the new version out, and then you could step away. And I'm like, that feels like so.
You're still contributing to the project by doing that, though. Semantic views, if you remember that module.
I
do remember it, yes.
And it was just because there was a bug, a critical bug that nobody would merge, or they didn't have the merge flow at that point. And the only thing I did in that module was merge it and do a release and update, I think, the module page.
So my theory is that module maintainership is not a life sentence. So you're going to go in there for a period of time. You're going to contribute to the project, whether that's getting one release out to help everybody get up to Drupal 10, or whether it's a longer, period of time of, staying engaged and helping with the issue queue. Likelihood is sooner or later, you're probably going to, have other demands on your time and drop off. Yeah. So contribute while you're interested in contributing, and don't view it as something that has to be like, this, like giving birth to a child that now you're responsible for it for 20 years. Like, I would say if you're passionate about helping that release get out, then just get that release out and don't view it as this long-term thing that you have to buy into.
I feel like it's different to going in to fix release. Like, so maybe you don't do anything on that module until Drupal 11 comes out, and then the only thing you do is merge the Rector thing and test it, right? I think that's a valuable service for the community. Like, you're not on the hook for fixing all the bugs or merging them or testing them, or like it's like, just make sure it's Drupal 10 compatible, that the tests run if there are tests, and that's it.
I feel like,
and it's a great way to keep your skills from rotting.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, he brought it full circle, folks. Full circle.
Nice.
I just feel like, I guess based on what we're saying here, like I can see the value in me becoming a maintainer just to get out the Drupal 10 version and like unblock myself and the few other people that are commenting on the issue. I also feel like there's a sense of ownership there. Like once I say, hey, I'm going to maintain this, like if a bug comes in, right? Like I feel like I need to have some level of ownership over that to say like, oh, I should probably fix that, look at it, address it somehow, in some way, shape, or form.
You.
It is up to me.
I think it's, like I said, I think it's different when you're doing it for major version releases versus like a bug fix. Like that was the discussion that I had a few weeks ago about how often you can comment on the issue, right? Because I think it's one thing to be like, oh, this is like, if it's just a bug fix for something, you can just apply the patch, right? Even if it takes 2 years for that bug fix to get merged in, right? You can just apply the patch. But like we said earlier, I'm not comfortable using the lenient composer endpoint on a production site. So it's like, if there's a bug, if there's a fix for getting to the newest version of Drupal, I think it's valuable to the community just to get that done and then step back. Like you're not
there's also a little less pressure, right? Because it's my personal site and I'm like, somebody will get to it eventually, right? So like where you're doing client work, Nick, I can see more of a necessity, right? Like if you're like, oh, I need this thing to be like done, like I got to jump in here and do it. Like that makes a lot more sense to me. I'm also feel like I'm pretty busy with a lot of other things. So like, I also don't want to say like, hey, let me go through the 2-week process or the 3-week process or whatever it is to become a maintainer. And then like, now I've got to like sit on my, like, it's going to be another 2 months before I get to it. Right. So it's like, I don't want to give the community false hope either that I'm going to like get maintainership, fix the problem and like unblock everybody, because I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
Yeah.
But anyway, Drupal 10 is great.
Yeah, I can't wait to use it. I'm very excited. I have like 3 or 4 sites that are on the cusp, and probably I'm about to apply for maintainership of a module because
if you want to maintain the recreate blocks module, it looks like there could
be used that module forever.
Catherine, I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you using Drupal for your personal site, or is it a WordPress site?
I was actually I was about to mention that I actually have a WordPress site that I threw up not too long ago. I would prefer to have a Drupal site. I was going to ask Al, so what's the current wisdom now that I've been away for a minute, and it's been a long time since I've tried to have a small Drupal site. I've maintained big ones with, Pantheon account or an Acquia Cloud or something like that. But can you run Drupal 10 on cheap hosting?
So,
not easily. You can.
I mean, Nick's gonna fight me here because I know he is. But like I run my site on Pantheon, and admittedly, I'm a Pantheon hero. So Pantheon.
Oh, I think Pantheon's great. I used to, Linux Journal was on Pantheon.
Yeah, so they give me hosting for my personal site, which I appreciate. But for me, it's like super easy to be able to run Drupal on Pantheon. And when I was paying for it myself, it was like, I think it was like,
back then it was like 25 a month. Now it's something like 50 or something.
Yeah, it's a little bit more expensive now than back when back in the day when it was like I think 35 or something like that. But like for the amount of stuff that you get, I feel like it's probably
I agree,
worthwhile.
Yeah, you get the full CI stuff, you get that. But the truth is,
you keep your skills from rotting.
Yeah.
Sorry, we gotta go back to that.
That is true. We're gonna keep coming back to that all day long.
So I'm also going to chime in here and say there is an article on opensource.com on how to run Drupal on a Raspberry Pi. So, that's another option. Again, not for everybody, because
I have a drawer full somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that was the appeal was like get some of those DevOps skills from getting Rusty, but, also the fact that there's like basically zero ongoing cost.
We should mention that you're the one that authored that article for
yes,
but we'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Wait. Was that shameless self-promotion? I like it.
That was shameless self-promotion, and a covert as well. So
if it has Raspberry Pi in it, it's wonderful self-promotion.
So going back to like your root question, right, of like running a Drupal site for your personal site. Yeah, I mean, I think it feels to me like it's become easier with Drupal 9 and Drupal 10. The one thing that I'm happy, like I'm going to upgrade to Drupal 10 once the modules get sorted out, right? And the one thing that I'm excited about there is being able to use Olivero as my front end theme, because with, I think it was in 10.01, maybe it's coming out in 10.1.0. I don't know, but somebody can correct me as I'm sure they will. But you have the ability to kind of do color selection in Olivero, which was missing in like previous versions. So you can now colorize it to like your color palette, and like you have the ability to kind of do some stuff there to like make it a little bit easier to kind of customize the front end of it with look and feel. And I think that's nice, because that's something I've always struggled with. Like, I'm not a front end developer by any means. Like, very, like, if you look at my website, you can tell I'm not a front end developer. So like, one of the things that was a barrier to me was like kind of like having that good looking website, which is what I think people, some people kind of drop into different platforms for. But I think that's kind of been alleviated a little bit with Drupal 10, and the new themes that have been added. So yes, I am an advocate. Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say quickly, I'm pretty sure that feature that you're talking about was actually in 10.0, so it's been in Drupal 10 since launch. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that unlike the color module that some people may remember that sort of like generated a bunch of extra CSS files, this is actually using CSS variables. So there's no, sort of like rendering process where, you've got all these files, but now if you like went in and customized those and then changed the colors, it would like break a bunch of things that you had done. So it's actually really slick.
Yes, Martin, you are correct. You are correct. And you think I would know that because I generated a meme that won me a sweatshirt based on colors being added to Olivero. But yeah. So
this is variables. Yeah.
I think Drupal 10, move away from WordPress, come to Drupal 10. That should be the motto there.
Maybe I'll do a Drupal powered static site generator thingy or something. I don't know. That sounds fun.
There is one, Tome. That's my site's a static site generated from Drupal 9. I host it on Netlify.
I think it's probably my next project is to move to that.
Yeah, if you want to look at Tome, you can set up a local.
Nick can mentor you in the ways of Tome and static site generation.
I will take you up on that.
Making connections right here.
Awesome. Okay, something else that's been on my mind is dependency management. So Drupal many years ago made the move to Composer. And I feel like something that I've noticed each time there's a major upgrade, there are a few things that the community hasn't quite coalesced around or figured out. And I love your opinions on them. Number one, when we first started using Composer, a lot of modules adopted the format 8.x whatever, and they're still using that. So you have a lot of modules that are version 8-x in 8.x-3, which is Drupal 9 and 10 compatible. It's not even Drupal 8 compatible anymore.
It's interesting because I was actually, I'm going to interject here a little bit, because I was actually going to bring this up during the Path Auto discussion, because I noticed that Path Auto is 8x 1.11, right? And like, I remember a year ago, 2 years ago, I don't know when it was. It was some time ago, right? There was like this push in the Drupal community to go to like more of a semantic versioning approach for modules, where it's like 1.11 and 2. And some modules have done it, some modules have not. I was wondering, like, any movement there? Is there like a team that's like working on that? Like,
I'm seeing that it's up to the module maintainer. I'm seeing new modules that are usually going semantic. But one of the problems that happens is if an existing module has 8.x and then they decide to go to semantic versioning and start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, Composer thinks that 8.x is newer than 1.0.0, even if 1.0.0 came out yesterday, because 8 is higher than 1. So the way that the semantic, the mapping in the Drupal packages is 8 will be newer than anything below 8.
So is that a Composer problem or a Drupal problem?
It's a Drupal thing. It's a Drupalism.
My understanding was that that would only happen if they went from, let's say, like 8.x-3.1, and then they started their semantic versioning at like 1.0.0.
Maybe it was maybe it was just from. Devel, because I know that Devel, if you tried installing Devel, you had to specify you wanted 4.0, otherwise it would install 8. Maybe it's the recommended version that they put in the module.
So I mean, isn't the solution here? And like again, I'm like overly simplifying as I tend to do sometimes, right? Isn't the solution here to just copy what you have in whatever your latest and greatest release is, or if you want to update your release, go for it. Copy that into a semantically versioned branch, right? 1.1. whatever, and then just either remove or like deprecate your previous one, right?
Yeah, but then you also have to notify all the problem is all the sites using ADA-X are using upgrade status to determine it. So you have to say, like, you have to tell the module that version is now deprecated and the new version is 1.0.0.
I mean, isn't that a function of Drupal.org?
Yeah, no, that already exists, but it's
okay.
Yeah,
it's just pressing buttons correctly is basically what you're saying.
And then, but there's also other edge cases. Like I know the Elasticsearch connector module, they store the version, like they version it based on the version of Elastic that it supports, right? So they have for Elastic 7, there's a 7 in there for Elastic 8, but it's not version 7 and version 8 of the module. It's version 1, 2, whatever. But yeah, it's a more complex issue. The other thing that I noticed, and I just found this out, ran into this issue this week, so this is fresh on my mind. I have a new client. They hired me specifically to help them get from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9. And they didn't sign the contracts until 2 weeks ago. But I evaluated everything about 2 months ago before Drupal 10 came out. So the normal process for upgrading to Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 is look at upgrade status, upgrade the modules to the most recent version that works in Drupal 8 and Drupal 8, because that will also be compatible with Drupal 9. Then upgrade Drupal, and then we can do the same thing for Drupal 10, right? Well, I discovered an issue with how Drupal modules manage their dependencies. So this site uses feeds and feeds tamper, if you remember those modules. The newest version of feeds drops support for Drupal 8. Okay, which is fine. And that's another thing too. Some modules, when they're upgrading for Drupal 10, some modules decided to release a brand new semantic version to drop support. Some didn't. Some just did a minor point release. So the newest version of feeds drop support for Drupal 8, which isn't a problem because you just get, like, if you update feeds, you just get the most recent version that is still compatible with Drupal 8, right? That's how Composer works. That's the beauty of Composer. Feeds tamper did not drop support for Drupal 8. So what that means is when you upgrade feeds tamper, you get the most recent version of feeds tamper, but you don't get the most recent version of feeds, which is fine.
Are they both compatible maintained by different people?
I have no idea. Now, here's the problem. The newest versions of feed tamper depends on functionality that's only in the newest version of feeds. So if you install both of those, you end up getting fatal errors on your site because feeds tamper is expecting stuff in the newest version of feeds, but the newest version of feeds isn't Drupal 8 compatible.
It sounds like there's maybe a Composer issue in feeds tamper. It should be requiring that latest version in there so that Composer wouldn't do that to you.
No, the problem is that feeds tamper didn't drop Drupal 8 support when feeds did. So you're getting the newer version of feeds tamper, but not the newer version of feeds.
Well, right, but what Martin's saying is that newer version of feeds tamper should require the newest version of feeds.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's a problem somewhere.
But that still causes a problem because it's depending, like it's saying it's Drupal 8 compatible, but it's depending on something that isn't. Like it's just, and again, like it's solvable. Even if I don't go back to the issues, it's because I can just find out what version of feeds tamper is out when the version of feeds that's getting installed is, and just require that version specifically, right? That'll solve the issue. But it's also one of those things that is, it's just an edge case. It's a dependency edge case, and I've seen this multiple times with major version upgrades. So again, it's a documentation.
It kind of speaks to the idea that, like, when you build an ecosystem of modules, or you have a module that is dependent on another module, right? You have to be very in tune with what that module is doing, right? So it sounds like maybe Feeds Tamper, and I haven't looked, so I don't know, but like maybe Feeds Tamper is maintained by somebody else, and they haven't kind of kept up on what Feeds is doing.
I don't think it is. I think it's less. It's less. It's more mundane than that. I think what it is the code in Feeds Tamper has nothing in it that is incompatible with Drupal 8, so they didn't drop Drupal 8 support. Feeds, the newest version of Feeds, has code that is incompatible with Drupal 8, so they dropped Drupal 8 support. And then they just develop them together, so when there's something new in Feeds, they just naturally add it to Feeds Tamper, not thinking that now gets them out of sync. Because the truth is, people should be off of Drupal 8 by now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it also seems like a little bit of an issue is where, like, I don't know, is the idea that Feeds is probably could potentially go away in
eventually
favor of like Migrate and Migrate API, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I like Feeds as like a site builder, like, because it doesn't require me to like write code to bring data in from a third party, right? So like, I think there's a place for Feeds in the Drupal ecosystem, but
no, I mean I agree. The goal is to get rid of Feeds Tamper in general, but honestly, right now they're on Drupal 8. Drupal 8 is insecure. My goal right now is, no matter what, like, don't worry about re-architecting the site. My goal is on these types of projects, because I've had a couple come in recently, like, hey, we're still on Drupal 8 and it's gone away, right? My goal is always just get them up on Drupal 9 immediately, right? So that they're secure. And then worry about re-architecting anything that needs re-architecting.
I will gladly move your site, and here's the rush fee.
So I had a quick look at the Feeds module and its releases, and I suspect that the issue is really because Feeds, instead of having stable releases, it is still on like 3.0 beta releases. And basically, when they added Drupal 10 compatibility, they went from 3.0 beta 2 to 3.0 beta 3. And so Composer probably doesn't have a really good way to say, require the beta 3 version within Feeds Tamper.
Yeah,
so that's where
possible.
If they actually did them as more like point releases on the Feeds side, then that would make it easy for Feeds Tamper to require the version that has the code needs to be stable.
You're highlighting one of the other issues with the Drupal community and Contrib in general too, is people no longer, in general, I mean, your modules are very much an exception. They don't do full releases. Even if they do a full release, they don't ever cut new releases. They do a full release at some point, and then everything just goes to dev for years and years and years and years. And then maybe the next major release, they do another release. Like,
I mean, one of the things I know, like Gabor has been working on the, what do they call it? Like the deprecation status tool that does reporting around like what versions are like Drupal 9 compatible or now Drupal 10 compatible. And one of the things that I know that they added within the past year is actually feedback within there to say, not only is a module like Drupal 10 ready, but also has a stable release to sort of like try and raise visibility on there. I mean, I definitely agree. It's a big issue in the community, and anything that we can do to sort of, nudge maintainers in the direction of creating those stable releases is definitely going to be a big help for everybody.
I mean, I'd be happy to share this, because this is probably an edge case that you want to catch, because it's a similar issue to what we discussed this on the show a few weeks ago, but it was a similar issue to what happened with better exposed filters, right? Better exposed filters released version 6.0 that was Drupal 10 compatible, but it depends on jQuery UI modules that weren't Drupal 10 compatible. So you couldn't install it. Like, if you told it to install, it would try to install jQuery UI, and then it would be like, hey, if you were on Drupal 9 and installed better exposed filters, it would work, because those jQuery modules are compatible with Drupal 9. But if you started with Drupal 10 and tried installing better exposed filters version 6, you couldn't install it because it depended on jQuery UI modules that weren't compatible with Drupal 10. But it's complicated. It's a complicated, when you have, like you said, John, when you have ecosystem modules like this, it becomes complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you looked at like media, right? You like, and media decided to drop support for something or change something, like you would have a whole ecosystem of modules that could be an issue. But I think the biggest takeaway here, and we've probably touched on this quite a bit now, right? Is both with our documentation and just this piece of the show, right? Is that like open source software is large and sometimes complex, and there are a lot of moving parts. So everybody's trying their best, and
I hate to be I feel like this episode is me raising issues that I don't have solutions for.
Yeah, don't worry.
But
the WordPress or Joomla communities will accept you with open arms.
No, I think sometimes the first step is talking about them, right? If people have ideas or thoughts on how to solve this, I'd love to hear them. Like we're always available on the Talking Drupal Slack if you have ideas. I mean, these are the things that need to be solved. They're not short. There's no short-term fixes, right? They're long-term. They're going to take probably multiple years to solve these issues. But step one is discussing it, right?
Or if you're the maintainer of the feeds tamper module and you want to give Nick a piece of your mind, feel free to reach out in Slack.
No, and actually, on that note, I'm glad you said that. I want to be very clear. Like, it's an edge case, but it's also I don't blame them, right? They're dropping support for Drupal 8, right? And I'm not really blocked from upgrading that module. I literally just have to look at, okay, when was Feeds Beta 2 released? Okay, let me just pin the Feeds Tamper version that came out at that same time, right? It's simple. It's not a huge burden for me. It's probably more of a burden for him to fix it, but it's an issue that I saw. And if there was a way to like check that and be like, hey, you're saying that you're Drupal 8 compatible, but you're depending on something that isn't, you might want to fix that. It'd be a nice flag for the maintainers.
Right. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's insights, and this has been as usual a very interesting and great conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email the show at talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, everyone, we have reached the end of our show. Catherine, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how would they go about doing it?
You can find me on Mastodon at Catherine D at Librem1. You can find me on Twitter still at Catherine D to an extent. You can find me on my sad WordPress site, catherinetruckman.com.
Soon to be Drupal 10.
Drupal and Tome. And you can find me at open.intel.com. I also have some announcements coming soon. So, look for me there.
Sweet. Martin, what about you?
Folks can find me on all the socials at ManClue, as well as on manclue.com.
Nick Laughlin?
Find me online at NixVan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.